For many years, the South African government enforced a system called apartheid. This system gave special treatment to the white minority, while people of other races were denied good jobs, schools, and homes. They couldn't vote, own land, or even travel freely. President Reagan decided not to interfere, and some thought his stance helped the white-run government. But in 1986, Congress went against Reagan's veto and put trade limits and sanctions on South Africa. When Bush took over, he supported these sanctions. Eventually, apartheid came to an end, and in 1994, South Africa got a new constitution and held democratic elections. In China, students were demanding freedom of speech in 1989. They held marches to speak out, which turned into huge protests in Tiananmen Square, Beijing. The Chinese army violently stopped the protests, killing hundreds and arresting many more. The whole world watched, and countries like the US condemned China's actions, putting economic sanctions in place. However, President Bush got criticized for meeting with the Chinese government, with some saying he cared more about money than human rights. Sadly, the pro-democracy movement in China fell apart after this crackdown. In 1979, rebels known as the Sandinistas took control of the government in Nicaragua, overthrowing the existing regime. President Carter sent aid to the country, as did the Soviet Union and Cuba. But by 1981, President Reagan accused the Sandinista government of being communist and backed a group called the Contras, who were fighting against them. After many years of fighting, a peace deal was finally signed, and Nicaragua held free elections in 1990. Reagan also sent U.S. troops to Grenada in 1983 because he was worried that the government there had connections with Cuba. The troops ended up overthrowing the pro-Cuban government and putting a pro-American one in its place. In 1989, President Bush sent over 20,000 U.S. troops to Panama. He wanted to get rid of Panama's leader, Manuel Noriega, who he accused of drug trafficking and being a dictator. American forces captured Noriega and brought him to Miami, where he was put on trial, found guilty, and sentenced to 40 years in prison. In 1983, terrorists linked to Iran kidnapped some Americans in Lebanon. Reagan criticized Iran and urged U.S. allies not to sell weapons to Iran for its war with Iraq. However, 3 years later, it came out that Reagan was going against his own policy. He had secretly approved selling arms to Iran, hoping it would help free the hostages in Lebanon. Some of the money from these sales also went to support the Contras in Nicaragua. These secret dealings became known as the Iran-Contra scandal. In 1987, Congress investigated the Iran-Contra scandal, and some of Reagan's aides were found guilty of crimes. In 1992, President Bush pardoned some of these people. In 1990, Iraq invaded Kuwait. On January 16, 1991, with backing from Congress and the United Nations, President Bush launched Operation Desert Storm to fight Iraq and liberate Kuwait. The U.S. and its allies launched airstrikes against Iraq and then a ground attack on February 23rd. President Bush announced a ceasefire on February 28th, ending the Persian Gulf War and freeing Kuwait.